On the 24th of March 1975, 5 RAF airmen climbed aboard a Victor tanker at RAF Marham for a routine training flight. Only one of them would come home. The man who survived may have escaped not because his ejection seat worked exactly as intended, but because, under forces powerful enough to make movement almost impossible, part of it may have broken. This is the story of Victor X-Ray Hotel 618, the Dream Machine, and a training exercise over the North Sea that went catastrophically wrong. By 1975, the Handley Page Victor had already undergone one of the most remarkable transformations in British military aviation. It had been designed as one of Britain's 3 V-bombers, alongside the Vulcan and Valiant, aircraft created during the early years of the Cold War to carry Britain's nuclear deterrent deep into hostile territory. But as Britain's nuclear strategy changed and the Polaris submarine programme took over much of that responsibility, the Victor B-1 and B-1A force was withdrawn from the bomber role, with many of the aircraft subsequently given an entirely different job. Instead of carrying nuclear weapons, they began carrying fuel. The Victor proved remarkably well suited to its new role. Hoses could be streamed from beneath the aircraft, each ending in a basket-like drogue, allowing fighters and strike aircraft to approach from behind, insert their refuelling probes, and take on fuel without either aircraft having to land. It was a remarkable operation when you stop to think about it. 2 large, fast-moving aircraft would deliberately fly within a few meters of one another, with the receiving aircraft operating in the disturbed air behind the tanker. The pilot of the receiving aircraft had to judge his position and closing speed carefully as he approached a drogue that was itself moving through the air ahead of him. Yet RAF crews did it routinely, and the Victor tanker force had developed an excellent safety record. On the 24th of March 1975, however, a Buccaneer approaching one of those drogues would close just a little too quickly, and within seconds that excellent safety record would count for nothing. Victor X-Ray Hotel 618 belonged to 57 Squadron at RAF Marham in Norfolk, and was known rather affectionately as the Dream Machine. In command that morning was Flight Lieutenant Keith Neddy Handscomb. Alongside him in the cockpit was Flying Officer John Arthur Price, while Flight Lieutenants David Hallam Crowther and Peter Joseph Leo Slatter and Flying Officer Terence Patrick Evans completed the 5-man crew. Not all of them would normally have been flying together. According to the later recollections of a 55 Squadron crew chief, the 2 flying officers had joined the 57 Squadron crew because they were short of flying hours for the month and had elected to make them up on this particular sortie. Their task that day was to work with Blackburn Buccaneers from 208 Squadron at RAF Honington. Originally developed for the Royal Navy, the Buccaneer was a formidable strike aircraft designed to travel at high speed and, when necessary, extremely low altitude. On this occasion, however, the crews would be practicing something rather different: air-to-air refuelling. Some of the approaches would involve what were known as dry contacts. The Buccaneer would come up behind the Victor and manoeuvre its refuelling probe into the drogue trailing from the tanker, exactly as it would during a genuine refuelling operation, but without actually taking on any fuel. It allowed the crews to practice the most difficult part of the procedure, bringing 2 aircraft together and making contact, without the additional complication of transferring fuel. And during the first attempts that morning, everything worked exactly as it should. Buccaneer X-Ray Victor 156 approached X-Ray Hotel 618 from behind and successfully made a dry contact with the hose beneath the Victor's starboard wing. Once the exercise was complete, the 2 aircraft separated and the Buccaneer moved across to practice another contact, this time using the hose on the Victor's port side. As X-Ray Victor 156 approached the drogue, however, its pilot realised that he was closing on it too quickly. At such close quarters, even a small difference in speed could quickly become critical. The Buccaneer pilot pulled back on the control column, but its refuelling probe struck the drogue and the aircraft began to climb. It now rose behind the Victor's port wing and into the narrow space between the wing's trailing edge and X-Ray Hotel 618's tailplane. There was almost nowhere for it to go. The Buccaneer struck the port side of the Victor's horizontal stabilizer, and almost immediately X-Ray Hotel 618 became uncontrollable. Witnesses would later describe its tail oscillating up and down. The aircraft bunted over and began plunging towards the North Sea. For the 5 men aboard X-Ray Hotel 618, a routine training exercise had suddenly become a catastrophe, and now one particular feature of the Victor's design became horribly important. Of the 5 men aboard, only the 2 pilots had ejection seats. The other 3 sat behind them in the rear compartment, and in an emergency were expected to escape using parachutes through a hatch in the aircraft. The system had been designed around the assumption that the pilots would be able to keep the Victor under control for long enough for the rear crew to leave their seats and make their way out, assisted by mechanisms intended to propel them towards the escape hatch. Only once those 3 men were clear would the pilots themselves eject. At least that was how it was supposed to work. It depended upon the aircraft remaining controllable for those precious few seconds. But after the collision with the Buccaneer, X-Ray Hotel 618 was anything but. As the Victor's nose pitched violently downwards, the men aboard were subjected to enormous negative G-forces. Rather than being forced down into their seats, their bodies were being pulled upwards against their restraints, making even the simplest movement extremely difficult. For the 3 men in the rear compartment, there was now no realistic means of reaching the hatch. The 2 pilots had ejection seats, but that did not necessarily mean they could use them. To fire those seats, they first had to be able to reach the firing handles, while their bodies were being subjected to forces powerful enough to prevent them from moving normally. Of the 5 men aboard, only Keith Handscomb escaped. And precisely how he managed to do it remains one of the most extraordinary parts of the story. For years, the accepted story of Keith Handscomb's escape was that despite the enormous forces acting upon him, he somehow managed to stretch one arm far enough to hook a finger around the lower firing handle of his ejection seat. It was an astonishing feat, and there appeared to be some evidence that he had done exactly that. Handscomb later noticed that one of his fingers was badly bruised, perhaps suggesting that in those desperate few seconds he really had managed to reach the handle. The problem was that Handscomb couldn't remember doing it. And many years later, a man who identified himself as a member of the RAF Board of Inquiry into the accident offered another possibility. Investigators, he recalled, believed that the upper latch of Handscomb's ejection seat may actually have failed under the enormous negative G-forces being generated as the Victor plunged downwards. If that was the case, Handscomb may not have deliberately fired the seat after all. The forces acting upon X-Ray Hotel 618 may themselves have caused it to eject from the aircraft. There was no way for Handscomb to settle the question. He had suffered extensive bruising across his body, meaning the injury to his finger proved very little, and he had no clear recollection of the moment his seat left the Victor. All that could be said with certainty was that somehow Keith Handscomb was thrown clear. The other 4 men were not. Moments later, X-Ray Hotel 618 disappeared into the cloud below and continued its plunge towards the North Sea. Accounts suggest that the Victor broke apart or possibly exploded somewhere around cloud top level before what remained of the aircraft fell into the water. Nothing could be done for the men still aboard. No bodies were ever recovered, and despite the searches that followed, the wreckage of the Dream Machine was never found. But X-Ray Hotel 618 had not been alone in the sky that morning. Buccaneer X-Ray Victor 156 had also been involved in the collision, and despite striking the Victor's tailplane, it remained controllable. Its crew survived and were eventually able to bring the damaged aircraft safely back to the ground. For Keith Handscomb, however, surviving the Victor was only the beginning of his ordeal. His ejection seat had carried him clear of X-Ray Hotel 618, but his parachute brought him down into the freezing waters of the North Sea. He was wearing an immersion suit, although later recollections from RAF personnel at Marham suggest he may not have been wearing the regulation clothing beneath it, and he was rapidly becoming dangerously cold. Fortunately, Handscomb had been spotted. A passing merchant vessel, identified in some later accounts as the German ship Hoherberg, manoeuvred close enough to offer him some protection from the swell, while its crew tried to get him out of the water. When they were unable to bring him aboard, one account suggests that they lowered or threw down a large dinghy in an attempt to help him. By now, a search and rescue operation was underway, and eventually a Whirlwind helicopter reached Handscomb and hauled him from the North Sea. He was flown initially to Scarborough Hospital, cold and badly bruised, but alive. Somehow one of the 5 men who had left RAF Marham aboard the Dream Machine that morning was coming home. David Crowther, Peter Slatter, Terence Evans and John Price would not. The investigation into the loss of X-Ray Hotel 618 faced considerable difficulties. There was no cockpit voice recorder to provide the crew's final conversation, and no flight data recorder giving investigators a second-by-second reconstruction of the Victor's final moments. Instead, they had to reconstruct those few seconds from the accounts of those who had witnessed the accident, including the surviving Buccaneer crew, together with what was known about the behaviour of the 2 aircraft during and immediately after the collision. Yet the loss of X-Ray Hotel 618 did result in changes. One concerned something as seemingly simple as the firing handle on the Victor pilot's ejection seats. According to the later recollections of a member of the RAF Board of Inquiry, the solid lower handle was subsequently replaced by a flexible loop, making it easier for a pilot to reach when movement was severely restricted. Given what may have happened to Keith Handscomb, it was a small modification with an obvious significance. The accident also had consequences for Buccaneer air-to-air refuelling training. Former Buccaneer personnel later recalled that 208 Squadron's refuelling conversion program came under scrutiny over possible procedural breaches and was stopped. When training resumed, experienced air-to-air refuelling instructors from 12 Squadron were brought in. The loss of X-Ray Hotel 618 had exposed weaknesses on both sides of the exercise, in the way the refuelling training was being conducted, and in an escape system which, under extreme forces, could become desperately difficult to use. 4 men had paid for those lessons with their lives. Keith Neddy Handscomb eventually recovered from his injuries and remarkably returned to flying. He remained fondly remembered by many of those who had served alongside him until his death in 2009. But for the families of the 4 men who died aboard X-Ray Hotel 618, there were questions that lasted considerably longer. In 2011, more than 36 years after the accident, the son of Flight Lieutenant David Crowther came across an online discussion about the loss of the Victor. He explained that he had grown up knowing remarkably little about exactly how his father had died. On the day of the accident, the family first learned that something had happened from the BBC television news. Only later that evening did the RAF telephone, before 2 officers arrived at their home. There would eventually be a memorial service at RAF Marham. But decades later, David Crowther's son was still trying to piece together the events of that Monday afternoon. Much of what had emerged from the inquiry had remained unavailable to the family, leaving him to search for answers among the memories of people who had been there. Perhaps that is what makes the story of X-Ray Hotel 618 linger. The accident itself lasted only seconds. Keith Handscomb somehow escaped, although even he could never say with certainty how. David Crowther, Peter Slatter, Terence Evans and John Price disappeared with the Dream Machine into the North Sea, and neither they nor the aircraft were ever recovered. For the Crowther family, and for the others who had watched those 5 men leave RAF Marham that morning, some answers came eventually. Others went down with X-Ray Hotel 618. Now, during my time in the RAF, I actually controlled countless refuelling sorties, including those involving Victor tankers. I was only responsible for joining the receivers with the tankers, but I was always aware of the difficulties and dangers facing all of the crews in these difficult procedures. Our condolences go out to the families and friends of those who lost their lives in this terrible tragedy. Despite the nature of the information, I hope you appreciated the way it was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.